Racist Karen calls 911 when I closed my own home. She had no idea what I found out. The sun was setting on Maple Street, casting long shadows across manicured lawns and well-kept homes. But the tranquility of this suburban paradise was about to be shattered. As I stood on my own front porch, keys in hand, I never could have imagined the storm that was about to break. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" A shrill voice cut through the evening air. I turned to see Karen, my neighbor from 3 houses down, marching towards me with purpose in her eyes and a cell phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. "I'm locking up my house," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. But Karen wasn't having it. "Your house? Don't make me laugh. I know the family that lives here, and you're not them. Step away from that door right now, or I'm calling the police." My heart raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, this was an accusation. An accusation based on nothing more than the color of my skin and Karen's own prejudices. "Karen, please. You're making a mistake. This is my property. I've owned it for years." But my words fell on deaf ears. Karen's fingers were already dancing across her phone screen, her voice rising in pitch as she spoke to the 911 operator. "Yes, there's a man here, trying to break into Johnson's house. He claims he owns it, but I know that's not true. Please hurry." As the wail of sirens grew closer, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me: anger, fear, disbelief. How had a simple act of securing my own property turned into this? Little did I know, this confrontation was just the beginning. The events that would unfold over the next few hours would not only challenge my rights as a homeowner but would also expose the deep-seated issues lurking beneath the surface of our seemingly peaceful neighborhood. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comment section, and if you're a lover of justice and inspirational stories, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more of this gripping story. To understand the events that unfolded on that fateful evening, we need to rewind the clock and delve into the history of our protagonist, and the house at the center of this controversy. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. The son of hardworking immigrants, I had clawed my way up from humble beginnings, putting myself through college and eventually establishing a successful small business. At 35, I had achieved what many would consider the American dream: a thriving career and a beautiful home in the suburbs. The house on Maple Street was more than just a property to me, it was a symbol of my success, a testament to my perseverance. With its sprawling lawn, white picket fence, and charming Victorian architecture, it was the kind of home I had only dreamed of as a child. But I was also a pragmatist. With the rising cost of living and a desire to help others, I made the decision to rent out rooms in my spacious home. I thought it was a win-win, I recall, my eyes distant as I remembered. I could offset some of my mortgage costs and provide affordable housing to those who needed it. Little did I know. At first, everything seemed perfect. I carefully vetted my tenants, renting to a mix of young professionals, students, and even a retired couple. The house buzzed with life, and I took pride in creating a diverse, harmonious living environment. However, as months passed, subtle changes began to occur. New faces appeared more frequently, often late at night. Strange noises emanated from certain rooms at odd hours. I tried to dismiss my growing unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. "It started with little things," I explained, my brow furrowed. "A broken lock here, a suspicious package there." But then I started noticing more, concerning signs. One night, I was awakened by a commotion outside. Peering through my bedroom window, I saw a group of men engaged in a heated argument on my front lawn. The next morning, I found discarded syringes in the bushes. As my suspicions grew, so did the tension in the neighborhood. Maple Street, once known for its tranquility, was now the subject of hushed conversations and worried glances. Crime rates, previously negligible, began to tick upward. Car break-ins, petty thefts, and even a reported assault had the community on edge. It was against this backdrop that Karen Wilkinson emerged as a self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. A middle-aged woman with a penchant for floral prints and an ever-present cell phone, Karen had lived on Maple Street for over 2 decades. She prided herself on knowing everything about everyone, or so she thought. Karen's relationship with I had always been cordial, if somewhat distant. She had initially welcomed me to the neighborhood with a plate of homemade cookies, but our interactions had been limited since then. Unbeknownst to me, Karen had been watching my house with growing suspicion. I just knew something wasn't right, Karen would later tell police, her voice quivering with self-righteousness. All those people coming and going at all hours. It wasn't natural. And then there was, well, you know. What Karen didn't say, but what became painfully clear, was that my race played a significant role in her suspicions. In her mind, a young black man couldn't possibly own such a grand house on Maple Street, at least, not legitimately. As I grappled with the realization that my tenants were engaging in illegal activities, I also had to contend with the growing hostility from neighbors like Karen. Whispers followed me at community events. Anonymous complaints were filed with the Homeowners Association. I felt increasingly isolated in the very community I had worked so hard to join. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday evening. I returned home early from work to find my living room transformed into what appeared to be a makeshift gambling den. Strangers lounged on my furniture, cards and cash strewn across the coffee table. In one corner, I spotted a young woman who looked barely of legal age, her eyes glazed and unfocused. That night, as I lay awake, the weight of my decision pressing down on me, I knew I had to act. The next morning, I began the process of evicting my tenants and reclaiming my home. It wasn't an easy decision. I consulted with lawyers, ensuring every step I took was legal. I provided my tenants with proper notice and even offered to refund their deposits in full if they left promptly. Some accepted graciously, others threatened legal action. Through it all, I remained resolute. I kept thinking about that young woman I saw, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I couldn't be part of that. I couldn't let my home be used for hurting people. As the day approached to finally secure my property, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. I had no way of knowing that my actions would spark a confrontation that would lay bare the prejudices and tensions simmering beneath the surface of Maple Street. What would you do if you discovered illegal activities happening on your own property? How far would you go to protect not just your investment, but your principles? As we'll see, my decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge not just my rights as a homeowner, but the very fabric of my community. The sun was setting on Maple Street as I stood on my porch, key in hand, ready to secure my newly emptied home. The weight of the past few weeks hung heavy on my shoulders, but there was also a sense of relief. Finally, I thought, things could return to normal. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Karen Wilkinson had been watching my house like a hawk for days. She had seen the steady stream of people leaving with boxes and suitcases, and her imagination had run wild. In her mind, this was clear evidence of some nefarious plot unfolding right before her eyes. As I turned the key in the lock, Karen's shrill voice cut through the evening air. "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" I turned, startled by the sudden interruption. "I'm locking up my house, Karen. Is there a problem?" Karen's eyes narrowed as she marched across the street, her floral muumuu fluttering in the breeze. "Your house? Don't make me laugh. I know the family that lives here, and you're certainly not them." The absurdity of the situation momentarily stunned me into silence. I had lived in this house for years and had exchanged pleasantries with Karen countless times. How could she possibly not recognize me as the owner? "Karen, there's been a misunderstanding. I've owned this house for 5 years. You've seen me here countless times," I explained, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable. But Karen was having none of it. Her voice rose in pitch as she jabbed an accusing finger at me. "Don't you try to fool me. I've seen what's been going on here. All sorts of people coming and going at all hours. And now you're trying to lock them out? Not on my watch." I felt a mix of frustration and disbelief rising within me. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. Karen, I understand you're concerned, but you're jumping to conclusions. I've had some issues with tenants, which I've now resolved. That's all. But Karen's eyes had taken on a wild gleam. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. I'm calling the police right now. We'll see who's telling the truth. As Karen's voice rose, recounting her version of events to the 911 operator, neighbors began to emerge from their homes. Curtains twitched, and curious faces peered out from behind partially opened doors. The quiet evening on Maple Street had suddenly become the stage for an unfolding drama. I stood rooted to the spot, a maelstrom of emotions swirling within me. Anger at Karen's baseless accusations. Frustration at having to defend my right to be in my own home. And beneath it all, a deep, gnawing fear. I knew all too well how situations like this could escalate, how quickly things could go wrong when the police were called on a black man, even one standing on my own property. The wail of sirens in the distance sent a chill down my spine. I took another deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. I knew I had done nothing wrong, but would that be enough? As two police cruisers pulled up, their lights painting the street in alternating flashes of red and blue, I raised my hand slowly, palms out. Officers, I called out calmly, I own this house. There's been a misunderstanding. The officers approached cautiously, their hands resting on their holsters. Sir, we received a call about a break-in at this address. Can you explain what's going on here? I nodded, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. Of course, officers. I've lived here for 5 years. I recently had some issues with tenants engaging in illegal activities, so I've evicted them and was just locking up the house. My neighbor Karen seems to have misunderstood the situation. Karen, who had been hovering nearby, interjected loudly. That's not true. I know the family that lives here, and he's not them. He's trying to break in. The officers exchanged glances, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Ma'am, please step back. Sir, do you have any identification or proof of ownership? I nodded. Yes, officer. My wallet is in my back pocket. May I reach for it? At the officer's nod, I slowly retrieved my ID and handed it over. I also have all the property documents inside. Would you like to see them? As one officer examined my ID, the other spoke into his radio, requesting a check on the property records. The tension on Maple Street was palpable as everyone waited for confirmation. Meanwhile, more neighbors had gathered, forming small clusters on the sidewalk. Whispered conversations and speculative glances bounced between I, Karen, and the police officers. The community that had once prided itself on its tranquility was now buzzing with a nervous energy. After what seemed like an eternity, but was in reality only a few minutes, the radio crackled to life. Dispatch to Unit 17. Property records confirm I, as the legal owner of 1242 Maple Street since 2018. The officers visibly relaxed, though Karen's face contorted in disbelief. That can't be right, she sputtered. I've seen. I know. One of the officers turned to Karen, his voice firm but not unkind. Ma'am, it appears there has indeed been a misunderstanding. He is the legal owner of this property. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Karen's demeanor shifted from righteous indignation to flustered embarrassment. But I saw all those people leaving. And the noise, and the strange cars. Something illegal was happening here. I, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anger, decided to address Karen's concerns directly. Karen, you're right that there were issues with some of my tenants. That's why I evicted them. I was trying to solve the problem and make our neighborhood safer. The officers, sensing the need to defuse the situation, began to question both I and Karen about the events leading up to this confrontation. As I calmly recounted my experiences with the problematic tenants and my efforts to rectify the situation, many of the gathered neighbors began to nod in understanding. One of the officers pulled out a notepad. Mr. Thompson, we've had a few reports of suspicious activity in this area over the past few months. Would you be willing to provide a statement about what you observed with your tenants? It could help with ongoing investigations. I agreed, realizing that my cooperation could potentially help prevent similar situations in other parts of the community. As I spoke with the officer, I could see the changing expressions on my neighbors' faces. Some looked ashamed for having doubted me, others seemed impressed by my handling of the situation. Karen, however, was not ready to concede. Her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and lingering suspicion. She attempted to justify her actions. Well, how was I supposed to know? With all the comings and goings, and him being, well, you know. The implication hung heavy in the air, causing several neighbors to shift uncomfortably. One of the officers fixed Karen with a stern look. Ma'am, making assumptions based on someone's race is not only wrong, it's potentially dangerous. Mr. Thompson could have been seriously harmed if the situation had escalated. As the gravity of her actions began to sink in, Karen's defiance crumbled. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. I, exhausted by the emotional roller coaster of the evening, simply nodded. I understand you were concerned, Karen. But next time, please just talk to me first. We're neighbors, after all. As the police prepared to leave, having determined no crime had been committed, the gathered neighbors began to disperse. But the events of the evening had left an indelible mark on the community of Maple Street. Some neighbors approached me, offering words of support and apology for not having stood up for me sooner. Others hung back, clearly processing the biases that had been laid bare. And a few, I noted with a sinking heart, hurried inside without a word, their own prejudices perhaps reinforced rather than challenged by the night's events. As the last police car pulled away, its lights no longer illuminating the now quiet street, I stood alone on my porch. I looked out at the neighborhood I had called home for 5 years, wondering how this incident would change the dynamics of their once peaceful community. How do you think this incident might affect the neighborhood dynamics moving forward? Will it serve as a wake-up call, prompting honest discussions about bias and community relations? Or will it deepen the divides that already existed beneath the surface? As we'll see in the final act of this story, the repercussions of this confrontation would extend far beyond that one eventful evening on Maple Street. As the first rays of sunlight crept over Maple Street the following morning, the events of the previous night hung heavy in the air. The quiet suburb, once a picture of tranquility, now seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of tension and unspoken questions. At the local police station, Officers Johnson and Martinez were concluding their report on the incident. "It's clear-cut," Officer Johnson said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Mr. Thompson is the legal owner of the property. We've verified his documentation and cross-checked with county records. There's no question about it." Officer Martinez nodded in agreement. The situation was tense, but Mr. Thompson handled it with remarkable composure. "It's unfortunate that it escalated to the point where we had to be called in." Their superior, Sergeant Williams, reviewed the report with a furrowed brow. "And what about the neighbor, Karen Wilkinson? Any grounds for charges?" The officers exchanged glances. "Technically," Officer Martinez began, "she did make a false report. But given the circumstances and the fact that she genuinely believed there was criminal activity." Sergeant Williams sighed heavily. "It's a delicate situation. We don't want to discourage citizens from reporting suspicious activity, but we also can't ignore the racial component here." After a moment of contemplation, he made his decision. "We'll issue Ms. Wilkinson a formal warning. And I want you both to follow up with Mr. Thompson about those potential illegal activities he mentioned with his former tenants. If there's truth to that, we need to investigate further." As the police were wrapping up their official response, the residents of Maple Street were grappling with the fallout in their own ways. Karen Wilkinson sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. The realization of her actions had hit her hard. She had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, a vigilant guardian of their suburban paradise. Now, she felt like a pariah. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages from neighbors and friends, some offering support, others expressing disappointment. The local community Facebook group was ablaze with discussions about the incident, with opinions sharply divided. As Karen scrolled through the comments, she felt a growing sense of shame. "I never meant for it to go this far," she whispered to herself. "I was just trying to protect our neighborhood. But, was I really? Or was I just?" She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. The word racist loomed in her mind, a label she had always vehemently rejected. But now, faced with the consequences of her actions, she was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about her own biases. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find Sarah, her next-door neighbor and longtime friend, standing there with a concerned expression. "Karen, we need to talk," Sarah said gently, stepping inside. As the two women sat down, Sarah took a deep breath. "Karen, I've known you for years, and I know you're not a bad person. But what happened last night, it wasn't right. We all need to do better." Tears welled up in Karen's eyes. "I don't know what came over me, Sarah. I was so sure something was wrong, and I didn't think." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "I know. But that's the problem, isn't it? We don't think about these things until we're forced to. Maybe this is our wake-up call. Not just for you, but for all of us." As Karen and Sarah continued their heart-to-heart across the street, I was also contemplating his next steps. I stood in my living room, surveying the space that had been the source of so much recent turmoil. The house felt emptier now, but also somehow lighter. I had already begun making plans for renovations, determined to reclaim the space and transform it back into the home he had always envisioned. But beyond the physical changes, I was grappling with the emotional and social implications of the previous night's events. I had always been aware of the undercurrent of prejudice that existed even in seemingly progressive communities like Maple Street. But to experience it so blatantly, on his own property, had shaken him. A text message alert drew my attention. It was from Michael, the president of the neighborhood association, requesting a meeting to discuss the incident and how to move forward as a community. I hesitated for a moment before replying with his agreement. Later that afternoon, I found myself seated at a table with Michael, several other board members, and to his surprise, Officer Johnson from the previous night. Michael cleared his throat nervously. "James, first and foremost, we want to extend our sincerest apologies for what happened. It's clear we have work to do as a community." I nodded, my expression neutral. "I appreciate that, Michael. But I hope you understand that apologies, while important, are just the beginning. What happened to me could have ended very differently under other circumstances." Officer Johnson leaned forward. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Thompson. And that's partly why I'm here. We want to work with the community to implement better training and protocols for reporting suspicious activity. We need to find a balance between vigilance and avoiding racial profiling." The discussion that followed was long and at times uncomfortable, but also deeply necessary. They talked about implementing community education programs, revising neighborhood watch guidelines, and creating spaces for open dialogue about race and bias. As the meeting wound down, I felt a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. "This won't be easy," I said, looking around the table. "These are deeply ingrained issues we're dealing with. But I'm willing to be part of the solution if you all are genuinely committed to change." The nods around the table were solemn and sincere. As I left the meeting, I felt a slight lightening of the weight on my shoulders. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. Over the following weeks and months, the incident on Maple Street became a catalyst for change, not just in their neighborhood, but in the wider community. Local news outlets picked up the story, sparking discussions about racial profiling, community policing, and the responsibilities of homeowners and neighbors. Karen, much to everyone's surprise, became an unlikely advocate for change. Her public apology and subsequent efforts to educate herself and others about unconscious bias earned her both criticism and praise. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was a necessary one. I, for my part, found myself in a position I had never anticipated, that of a community leader. Our measured responses and willingness to engage in difficult conversations made me a respected voice in ongoing efforts to create a more inclusive neighborhood. As for Maple Street itself, the changes were subtle but significant. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now made efforts to connect. Community events became more diverse and inclusive. And while tensions and misunderstandings still occurred, there was a new willingness to address them openly and honestly. 1 year after the incident, as I stood on my porch looking out at the street I now felt truly a part of, I reflected on how a moment of conflict had led to a movement of change. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but it was progress. What lessons can we all learn from this incident to create a more understanding and just society? Perhaps it's the recognition that change begins with uncomfortable conversations and personal reflection. Or maybe it's the understanding that true community safety comes not from suspicion and division, but from connection and understanding. As we conclude our journey down Maple Street, we're left with the realization that the path to a more just society is neither straight nor easy. It's a road paved with difficult conversations, personal growth, and collective action. But as the residents of Maple Street discovered, it's a journey worth taking, one step at a time. As we draw our story to a close, the events that unfolded on Maple Street serve as a powerful reminder of the work that still needs to be done in our communities. But they also highlight the potential for growth, understanding, and positive change, even in the face of deeply ingrained biases and misunderstandings. Now, we turn to you, our viewers. My story, Karen, and the residents of Maple Street isn't just a tale to be passively consumed. It's a call to action, a challenge to each of us to examine our own thoughts, behaviors, and the roles we play in our communities. First and foremost, we must have the courage to examine our own biases. It's easy to point fingers at others, to identify prejudice in those around us. But true change begins with self-reflection. Ask yourself, have I ever made assumptions about someone based on their appearance? Have I ever felt uncomfortable in a situation simply because someone looked different from me? These aren't easy questions to answer, but they're necessary ones. Try this exercise. For the next week, pay close attention to your initial reactions when you encounter people who are different from you. Notice your thoughts, your feelings, your instinctive responses. Don't judge these reactions, simply observe them. This awareness is the first step towards change. Next, I encourage you to promote open dialogue in your own communities. The residents of Maple Street learned the hard way that silence and assumptions can lead to misunderstandings and conflict. But they also discovered the transformative power of honest, respectful communication. Consider organizing a community forum or discussion group. Create a safe space where people can share their experiences, voice their concerns, and learn from one another. Remember, the goal isn't to agree on everything, but to foster understanding and respect for different perspectives. Here's a practical step you can take. Reach out to a neighbor you don't know well, especially if they're from a different background than yours. Invite them for a coffee or a chat. Listen to their stories, share your own. These small acts of connection can ripple out, creating a more cohesive and empathetic community. Supporting initiatives for better neighbor relations is another crucial step. Look for existing programs in your area that promote community building and intercultural understanding. If there aren't any, consider starting one. This could be as simple as a neighborhood potluck where everyone brings a dish from their cultural background, or as involved as partnering with local organizations to provide diversity and inclusion training for community members. Remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process that requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to sometimes be uncomfortable. But as we've seen in the story of Maple Street, the results can be transformative. As we reflect on the power of understanding and empathy, let's consider the words of Maya Angelou: do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. The residents of Maple Street embarked on a journey of knowing better and doing better. Now, it's our turn. Knowing your rights and responsibilities as a community member is also crucial. Familiarize yourself with local laws and regulations. Understand what constitutes suspicious behavior and what doesn't. Learn about proper procedures for reporting concerns. Knowledge is power, and in situations like the one I faced, it can be the difference between conflict and resolution. Consider this: if Karen had known and respected my rights as a property owner, if she had approached the situation with curiosity instead of suspicion, how differently might events have unfolded? By educating ourselves and our neighbors about our rights and responsibilities, we create a foundation for more just and equitable communities. Finally, let's reflect on the potential for positive change, even in difficult situations. The story of Maple Street could have ended with the confrontation between I and Karen. It could have devolved into further mistrust and division. Instead, it became a catalyst for growth, understanding, and community building. This potential for positive change exists in every challenging situation we face. When confronted with prejudice or misunderstanding, we have a choice. We can react with anger or defensiveness, or we can see it as an opportunity for education and growth. We can choose to build bridges instead of walls. As we conclude my journey down Maple Street, I leave you with this thought: every interaction, every conversation, every moment of connection or conflict is an opportunity. An opportunity to learn, to grow, to challenge our assumptions, and to build a more understanding and just society. The path forward isn't always clear or easy. There will be missteps and misunderstandings along the way. But as the residents of Maple Street discovered, the journey is worth it. Because at the end of that journey lies a community where diversity is celebrated, where differences are respected, and where every person feels seen, heard, and valued. So, what will you do with this opportunity? How will you contribute to creating a more understanding and just society in your own community? The choice is yours. And remember, just as a small stone can create ripples across an entire pond, your actions, no matter how small they may seem, have the power to create waves of positive change. As we fade to black, I leave you with one final question to ponder: what will be your Maple Street moment? How will you turn a challenge into an opportunity for growth and positive change in your community? Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more.